Next Level Soul Publishing presents The Bible's Hidden Code, Unlocking the Ancient Mystical Laws of the Universe by Thomas Troward. Read by William Sterling. Introduction. For centuries, the Bible has been read, preached, and argued over. It has been brandished as a weapon of doctrine, reduced to dogma, and quoted to bolster politics, morality, and personal agendas. Yet very few approach it for what it truly is, not merely a collection of ancient stories, but a great tapestry of universal law. The Bible, when read with unclouded eyes, is not a book of restrictions, but a manual of emancipation. It whispers that human beings are not powerless creatures abandoned to fate, but bearers of the same creative spark that set the heavens in motion. Thomas Troward, a judge by profession and a mystic by temperament, saw this with startling clarity. In his The Bible's Hidden Code, Unlocking the Ancient Mystical Laws of the Universe, formerly Bible Mystery and Bible Meaning, he argued that behind the words, symbols, and parables lies a hidden code, a set of principles about consciousness, creation, and the nature of reality. He insisted that the Bible is not an anthology of myths or mere moral tales, but a record of mystical laws expressed in allegory, poetry, and story. And when one learns to read it aright, these laws can be recognized as universal and scientific in their operation. What are these laws? They are the principles of spirit itself, the power of thought to create, the way suggestion shapes reality, the recognition that man is made in the image and likeness of God. Troward reminds us that this is not an idle metaphor. To be in the image of God is not to resemble a celestial figure in form or costume, but to share in the divine capacity to think, imagine, and bring into being. Creation itself, he argued, proceeds by the movement of spirit into form, by the passing of invisible thought into visible manifestation. And this process is not limited to some distant deity. It is happening within us, right now, with every thought we cultivate and every belief we cling to. To realize this is to begin to see the Bible in an entirely new light, no longer as a static record of what once happened, but as a living instruction manual for what is happening in every soul, in every age. The fall, the flood, the Exodus, the building of the temple, the words of the prophets, the mission of Christ. These are not simply historical episodes or theological abstractions. They are archetypes, parables of the inner life, describing the rise and fall of consciousness as it learns, forgets, and remembers its divine origin. Troward showed us that the Bible's meaning is twofold. It is veiled in symbols to protect those who are not yet ready to wield such power, but open to those who seek with sincerity, humility, and reason. For to grasp that thought creates, that belief shapes reality, is to handle the very forces by which worlds are made. Used without wisdom, this truth can bind us deeper into fear and separation. Used with clarity and love, it can liberate us into peace, health, and abundance. This Next Level Soul edition has been prepared to help you enter that code with clarity and practice. Troward's writing is luminous but can be dense, shaped by the style of his time. Here, his original words are preserved, but each chapter is followed by features to ground his insights in your daily life. Chapter summaries that capture the essence of his argument. Key points that highlight the universal truths woven through Scripture. Action items that translate mystical principles into practical steps. You can begin today. The intention is simple: to bridge understanding and embodiment. For hidden knowledge is of little use if it is left on the page. The Bible's code is not a curiosity, it is a way of living. Each principle, when practiced, reveals its reality. Each law, when embodied, transforms not only thought, but circumstance. To unlock the Bible's hidden code is to see these stories as mirrors of your own life. They are not distant legends. They are reflections of your present condition, your struggles, and your potential awakening. To approach the Bible in this way is to recognize that its wisdom is not finished. It is alive. Every generation must discover its meaning anew, not by abandoning the past, but by letting ancient truths take root in present soil. What Troward uncovered in his time remains urgent for ours. The laws of spirit are unchanging, but our need to apply them is ever fresh. The Bible's hidden code is not about memorizing doctrines or clinging to rigid interpretations. It is about learning to live in harmony with the laws that govern both the seen and the unseen. Just as gravity operates whether we acknowledge it or not, so too do these spiritual laws. The choice is whether to move unconsciously under their weight or consciously with their flow. That is why this edition insists on practice. The summaries are your compass, the key points your landmarks, and the action items your first steps on the path. Together, they ensure the journey does not remain abstract. They allow you to test, to experience, and to see with your own eyes that these truths are not speculative. They are demonstrable. And as you take them into your life, you may begin to notice subtle but unmistakable shifts. The stories of Adam, of Moses, of Christ, cease to be distant figures on a page and become inner archetypes. You see yourself in their struggles, their exiles, their revelations. You feel the resonance between the trials they endured and the choices you face today. What once seemed like myth becomes mirror. The hidden code is not meant to elevate you above others, nor to burden you with impossible ideals. It is meant to awaken you to the fact that you are already part of the great unfolding of spirit. The creative power of thought is in you now. The ability to rise, to forgive, to renew, is in you now. The law of liberty, of expansion, of peace, it is in you now. Take these truths slowly. Test them gently. Let them shape how you think, how you act, how you respond to life. For in living them, the code unlocks itself. The more faithfully you apply them, the more clearly you will see that the Bible has never been about distant events or external authorities. It has always been about the awakening of spirit in you. And so the invitation stands. Do not leave this knowledge here on the page. Carry it with you into thought, into word, into deed. Allow the Bible's hidden code to reveal itself in the small moments of your day and the great decisions of your life. For when you do, you will see that its mysteries are not only ancient, they are eternal. And they are written indelibly in the soul that you are. Chapter 1. The Creation. The Bible is the book of the emancipation of man. The emancipation of man means his deliverance from sorrow and sickness, from poverty, struggle, and uncertainty, from ignorance and limitation, and finally, from death itself. This may appear to be what the euphuistic colloquialism of the day would call a tall order, but nevertheless, it is impossible to read the Bible with a mind unwarped by antecedent conceptions derived from traditional interpretation without seeing that this is exactly what it promises, and that it professes to contain the secret whereby this happy condition of perfect liberty may be attained. Jesus says that if a man keeps his saying, he shall never see death. John 8:51. In the book of Job, we are told that if a man has with him a messenger, an interpreter, he shall be delivered from going down to the pit, and shall return to the days of his youth. Job 33:24. The Psalms speak of our renewing our youth. Psalm 103:5. And yet again we are told in Job that by acquainting ourselves with God we shall be at peace. We shall lay up gold as dust, and have plenty of silver. We shall decree a thing, and it shall be established unto us. Job 22:21-23. Now, what I propose is that we shall reread the Bible on the supposition that Jesus and these other speakers really meant what they said. Of course, from the standpoint of the traditional interpretation, this is a startling proposition. The traditional explanation assumes that it is impossible for these things to be literally true, and therefore it seeks some other meaning in the words, and so gives them a spiritual interpretation. But in the same manner we may spiritualize away an Act of Parliament, and it hardly seems the best way of getting at the meaning of a book to follow the example of the preacher who commenced his discourse with the words, "Beloved brethren, the text doth not mean what it saith." Let us, however, start with the supposition that these texts do mean what they say, and try to interpret the Bible on these lines. It will at least have the attraction of novelty, and I think if the reader gives his careful attention to the following pages, he will see that this method carries with it the conviction of reason. If a thing is true at all, there is a way in which it is true, and when the way is seen, we find that to be perfectly reasonable which, before we understood the way, appeared unreasonable. We all go by railroad now, yet they were esteemed level-headed practical men in their day who proposed to confine George Stephenson as a lunatic for saying that it was possible to travel at 30 miles an hour. The first thing to notice is that there is a common element running through the texts I have quoted. They all contain the idea of acquiring certain information, and the promised results are all contingent on our getting this information and using it. Jesus says it depends on our keeping his saying, that is, receiving the information which he had to give and acting upon it. Job says that it depends on rightly interpreting a certain message, and again that it depends on our making ourselves acquainted with something. And the context of the passage in the Psalms makes it clear that the deliverance from death and the renewal of youth there promised are to be attained through the ways which the Lord made known unto Moses. In all these passages, we find that these wonderful results come from the attainment of certain knowledge, and the Bible therefore appeals to our reason. From this point of view, we may speak of the science of the Bible, and as we advance in our study, we shall find that this is not a misuse of terms, for the Bible is eminently scientific, only its science is not primarily physical, but mental. The Bible contemplates man as composed of spirit, soul, and body, 1 Thessalonians 5:23, or in other words as combining into a single unity a threefold nature, spiritual, psychic, and corporeal. And the knowledge which it proposes to give us is the knowledge of the true relation between these three factors. The Bible also contemplates the totality of all being, manifested and unmanifested, as likewise constituting a threefold unity, which may be distributed under the terms God, man, and the universe, and it occupies itself with telling us of the interaction, both positive and negative, which goes on between these three. Furthermore, it bases this interaction upon two great psychological laws, namely, that of the creative power of thought, and that of the amenability of thought to control by suggestion, and it affirms that this creative power is as innately inherent in man's thought as in the divine thought. But it also shows how through ignorance of these truths we unknowingly misuse our creative power, and so produce the evils we deplore. And it also realizes the extreme danger of recognizing our power before we have attained the moral qualities which will fit us to use it in accordance with those principles which keep the great totality of things in an abiding harmony. And to avoid this danger, the Bible veils its ultimate meaning under symbols, allegories, and parables. But these are so framed as to reveal this ultimate meaning to those who will take the trouble to compare the various statements with one another, and who are sufficiently intelligent to draw the deductions which follow from thus putting two and two together. While those who cannot thus read between the lines are trained into the requisite obedience to the universal law by means of suggestions suited to the present extent of their capacity, and are thus gradually prepared for the fuller recognition of the truth as they advance. Seen in this light, the Bible is found not to be a mere collection of old-world fables or unintelligible dogmas, but a statement of great universal laws, all of which proceed simply and naturally from the initial truth that creation is a process of evolution. Grant the evolutionary theory, which every advance in modern science renders clearer, and all the rest follows, for the entire Bible is based upon the principle of evolution. But the Bible is a statement of universal law, of that which obtains in the realm of the invisible as well as that which obtains in the realm of the visible, and therefore it deals with facts of a transcendental nature as well as with those of the physical plane, and accordingly it contemplates an earlier process anterior to evolution, the process, namely, of involution, the passing of spirit into form, as antecedent to the passing of form into consciousness. If we bear this in mind, it will throw light on many passages which must remain wrapped in impenetrable obscurity until we know something of the psychic principles to which they refer. The fact that the Bible always contemplates evolution as necessarily preceded by involution should never be lost sight of, and therefore much of the Bible requires to be read as referring to the involutionary process taking place upon the psychic plane. But involution and evolution are not opposed to one another. They are only the earlier and later stages of the same process, the perpetual urging onward of spirit for self-expression in infinite varieties of form. And therefore, the grand foundation on which the whole Bible system is built up is that the Spirit, which is thus continually passing into manifestation, is always the same Spirit. In other words, it is only one. These two fundamental truths, that under whatever varieties of form the Spirit is only one, and that the creation of all forms, and consequently of the whole world of conscious relations, is the result of Spirit's one mode of action, which is thought, are the basis of all that the Bible has to teach us. And therefore, from its first page to its last, we shall find these two ideas continually recurring in a variety of different connections, the oneness of the divine Spirit and the creative power of man's thought, which the Bible expresses in its two grand statements, that God is one, and that man is made in the image and likeness of God. These are the two fundamental statements of the Bible, and all its other statements flow logically from them. And since the whole argument of Scripture is built up from these premises, the reader must not be surprised at the frequency with which our analysis of that argument will bring us back to these two initial propositions. So far from being a vain repetition, this continual reduction of the statements of the Bible to the premises with which it originally sets out, is the strongest proof that we have in them a sure and solid foundation on which to base our present life and our future expectations. But there is yet another point of view from which the Bible appears to be the very opposite of a logically accurate system built upon the broad foundations of natural law. From this point of view, it at first looks like the egotistical and arrogant tradition of a petty tribe, the narrow book of a narrow sect, instead of a statement of universal truth. And yet, this aspect of it is so prominent that it can by no means be ignored. It is impossible to read the Bible and shut our eyes to the fact that it tells us of God making a covenant with Abraham, and thenceforward separating his descendants by a divine interposition from the remainder of mankind. For this separation of a certain portion of the race as special objects of the divine favor forms an integral part of Scripture, from the story of Cain and Abel to the description of the camp of the saints and the beloved city in the book of Revelation. We cannot separate these two aspects of the Bible, for they are so interwoven with one another that if we attempt to do so, we shall end by having no Bible left, and we are therefore compelled to accept the Bible statement as a whole or reject it altogether, so that we are met by the paradox of a combination between an all-inclusive system of natural law and an exclusive selection, which at first appears to flatly contradict the processes of nature. Is it possible to reconcile the two? The answer is that it is not only possible, but that this exclusive selection is the necessary consequence of the universal law of evolution when working in the higher phases of individualism. It is not that those who do not come within the pale of this selection suffer any diminution, but that those who do come within it receive thereby a special augmentation. And, as we shall see by and by, this takes place by a purely natural process resulting from the more intelligent employment of that knowledge which it is the purpose of the Bible to unfold to us. These two principles of the inclusive and the exclusive are intertwined in a double thread which runs all through Scripture, and this dual nature of its statements must always be borne in mind if we would apprehend its meaning. Asking the reader, therefore, to carefully go over these preliminary remarks as affording the clue to the reason of the Bible statements, I shall now turn to the first chapter of Genesis. The opening announcement that, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth," contains the statement of the first of those two propositions, which are the fundamental premises from which the whole Bible is evolved. From the Master's instruction to the woman of Samaria, we know that God means spirit, not a spirit, as in the authorized version, thus narrowing the divine being with the limitations of individuality, but as it stands in the original Greek, simply spirit, that is, all spirit, or spirit in the universal. Thus the opening words of the Bible may be read, "In the beginning spirit," which is a statement of the underlying universal unity. Here let me draw attention to the twofold meaning of the words "in the beginning." They may mean first in order of time, or first in order of causation, and the latter meaning is brought out by the Latin version, which commences with the words "in principio," that is, in principle. This distinction should be borne in mind, for in all subsequent stages of evolution, the initial principle which gives rise to the individualized entity must still be in operation, as the fons et origo of that particular manifestation, just as much as in its first concentration. It is the root of the individuality, without which the individuality would cease to exist. It is the beginning of the individuality in order of causation, and this beginning is, therefore, a continuous fact, always present, and not to be conceived of as something which has been left behind and done with. The same principle was, of course, the beginning of the entity in point of time also, however far back in the ages we may suppose it to have first evolved into separate existence, so that whether we apply the idea to the cosmos or to the individual, the words "in the beginning" both carry us back to the primordial outpush from non-manifestation into manifestation, and also rivet our attention upon the same power as still at work, as the causal principle both in ourselves and in everything else around us. In both these senses, then, the opening words of the Bible tell us that the beginning of everything is God, or Spirit, in the universal. The next statement, that God created the heaven and the earth, brings us to the consideration of the Bible way of using words. The fact that the Bible deals with spiritual and psychic matters makes it of necessity an esoteric book, and therefore, in common with all other esoteric literature, it makes a symbolic use of words for the purpose of succinctly expressing ideas which would otherwise require elaborate explanation, and also for the purpose of concealing its meaning from those who are not yet safely to be entrusted with it. But this need not discourage the earnest student, for by comparing one part of the Bible with another, he will find that the Bible itself affords the clue to the translation of its own symbolical vocabulary. Here, as in so many other instances, the Master has given us the key to the right interpretation. He says that the kingdom of heaven is within us. In other words, that heaven is the kingdom of the innermost and spiritual, and if so, then by necessary implication, earth must be the symbol of the opposite extreme, and must metaphorically mean the outermost and material. We are starting the history of the evolution of the world in which we live. That is to say, this power which the Bible calls God is first presented to us in the opening words of Genesis, at a stage immediately preceding the commencement of a stupendous work. Now, what are the conditions necessary for the doing of any work? Obviously, there must be something that works, and something that is worked upon, an active and a passive factor, an energy and a material on or in which that energy operates. This, then, is what is meant by the creation of heaven and earth. It is that operation of the eternally subsisting One upon itself which produces its dual expression as energy and substance. And here remark carefully that this does not mean a separation, for energy can only be exhibited by reason of something which is energized, or, in other words, For life to manifest at all, there must be something that lives. This is an all-important truth, for our conception of ourselves as beings separate from the divine life is the root of all our troubles. In its first verse, therefore, the Bible starts us with the conception of energy or life inherent in substance, and shows us that the two constitute a dual unity, which is the first manifestation of the infinite unmanifested one. And if the reader will think these things out for himself, he will see that these are primary intuitions, the contrary of which it is impossible to conceive. He may, if he please, introduce a demiurge as part of the machinery for the production of the world. But then he has to account for his demiurge, which brings him back to the undistributed one, of which I speak, and its first manifestation as energy inherent in substance. And if he is driven back to this position, then it becomes clear that his demiurge is a totally unnecessary wheel in the train of evolutionary machinery. And the gratuitous introduction of a factor which does no work but what could equally be done without it is contrary to anything we can observe in nature or can conceive of a self-evolving power. But we are particularly cautioned against the mistake of supposing that substance is the same thing as form, for we are told that the earth was without form. This is important because it is just here that a very prolific source of error in metaphysical studies creeps in. We see forms which, simply as masses, are devoid of an organized life corresponding to the particular form, and therefore we deny the inherency of energy or life in ultimate substance itself. As well deny the pungency of pepper because it is not in the particular pepper pot we are accustomed to. No, that primordial state of substance with which the opening verse of the Bible is concerned is something very far removed from any conception we can have of matter as formed into atoms or electrons. We are here only at the first stage of involution, and the presence of material atoms is a stage, and by no means the earliest, in the process of evolution. We are next told that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Here we have two factors, spirit and water, and the initial movement is attributed to spirit. This verse introduces us to that particular mode of manifestation of the universal substance, which we may denominate the psychic. This psychic mode of the universal substance may best be described as cosmic soul essence, not, indeed, universal in the strictest sense otherwise than as always included in the original primordial essence, but universal to the particular world system under formation, and as yet undifferentiated into any individual forms. This is what the medieval writers spoke of as the soul of the universe, or anima mundi, as distinguished from the divine spirit, or animus Dei, and it is the universal psychic medium in which the nuclei of the forms hereafter, to become consolidated on the plane of the concrete and material, take their inception in obedience to the movement of the spirit, or thought. This is the realm of potential forms, and is the connecting link between spirit, or pure thought, and matter, or concrete form, and as such plays a most important part in the constitution of the cosmos and of man. In our reading of the Bible as well as in our practical application of mental science, the existence of this intermediary between spirit and matter must never be lost sight of. We may call it the distributive medium, in passing through which the hitherto undistributed energy of spirit receives differentiation of direction, and so ultimately produces differentiation of forms and relations on the outermost or visible plane. This is the cosmic element, which is esoterically called water. And so long ago as the reign of Henry VIII, Dean Colet explains it thus in a letter to his friend Randolph. Dean Colet was very far from being a visionary. He was one of the precursors of the Reformation in England, and among the first to establish the study of Greek at Oxford, and as the founder of St. Paul's School in London, he took a leading part in introducing the system of public school education, which is still in operation in this country. There is no mistaking Dean Colet for any other than a thoroughly level-headed and practical man, and his opinion as to the meaning of the word water in this connection therefore carries great weight. But we have the utterance of a yet higher authority on this subject, for the Master himself concentrates his whole instruction to Nicodemus on the point that the new birth results from the interaction of spirit and water, especially emphasizing the fact that the flesh has no share in the operation. This distinction between the flesh, or the outermost principle, and water should be carefully noted. The emphasis laid by the Master on the nothingness of the flesh and the essentialness of water must mark a distinction of the most important kind, and we shall find it very helpful in unraveling the meaning of many passages of the Bible to grasp this distinction at the outset. The action of spirit upon water is that of an active upon a passive principle, and the result of any sort of work is to reconstruct the material worked upon into a form which it did not possess before. Now the new form to be produced, whatever it may be, is a result, and therefore is not to be enumerated among the causes of its own production. Hence it is a self-obvious truism that any act of creative power must take place at a more interior level than that of the form to be created, and accordingly, whether in the Old or the New Testament, the creative action is always contemplated as taking place between the spirit and the water. Whether we are thinking of producing a new world or a new man, we must always go back to first cause operating on primary substance. We are told that the first product of the movement of spirit upon water was light, thereby suggesting an analogy with the discoveries of modern science that light and heat are modes of motion. But the statement that the sun was not created till the fourth day guards us against the mistake of supposing that what is here meant is the light visible to the physical eye. Rather, it is that all-pervading inner light, of which I shall have more to say by and by, and which only becomes visible as the corresponding sense of inward vision begins to be developed. It is that psychic condition of the universal substance in which the auras of the potentials of all forms may be discovered, and where, consciously or unconsciously, the spirit determines the forms of those things which are to be. Like all other knowledge, the knowledge of the inner light is capable of application at higher and at lower levels, and the premature recognition of its power at the lower levels, uncontrolled by the recognition of its higher phases, is one of the most dangerous acquisitions. But duly regulated by the higher knowledge, the lower is both safe and legitimate, for in its due order it also is part of the universal harmony. The initial light having thus been produced, the introduction of the firmament on the second day indicates the separation of the spiritual principles of the different members of the world system from one another, and the third day sees the emanation of earth from the water, or the production of the actual corporeal system of nature, the commencement of the process of evolution. Up to this point, the action has been entirely upon the inner plane of water, that is to say, a process of involution, and consistently with this it was impossible for the heavenly bodies to begin giving physical light until the fourth day, for until then no physical sun or planets could have existed. With the fourth day, however, the physical universe is differentiated into shape, and on the fifth day the terrestrial waters begin to take their share in the evolutionary process by spontaneously producing fish and fowl. And here we may remark in passing how Genesis has forestalled modern science in the discovery that birds are anatomically more closely related to fishes than to land animals. The terrestrial earth, I call it so to distinguish it from symbolic earth, already on the third day impregnated with the vegetable principle, takes up the evolutionary work on the sixth day, producing all those other animal races which had not already originated in the waters, and thus the preparation of the world as an abode for man is completed. It would be difficult to give a more concise statement of evolution. Originating spirit subsists at first as simple unity. Then it differentiates itself into the active and passive principles spoken of as heaven and earth, or spirit and water. From these proceed light and the separation into their respective spheres of the spiritual principles of the different planets, each carrying with it the potential of the self-reproducing power. Then we pass into the realm of realization, and the work that has been done on the interior planes is now reproduced in physical manifestation, thus marking a still further unfoldment. And finally, in the phrases, "Let the waters bring forth" and "Let the earth bring forth," the land and water of our habitable globe are distinctly stated to be the sources from which all vegetable and animal forms have been evolved. Thus creation is described as the self-transforming action of the one unanalyzable spirit, passing by successive transitions into all the varieties of manifestations that fill the universe. And here we may notice a point which has puzzled commentators unacquainted with the principles on which the Bible is written. This is the expression, "The evening and the morning were the first, second, etc., day." Why, it is asked, does each day begin with the evening? And various attempts have been made to explain it in accordance with Jewish methods of reckoning time. But as soon as we see what the Bible statement of creation is, the reason at once becomes clear. The second verse of the Bible tells us that the starting point was darkness, and the coming forth of light out of darkness cannot be stated in any other order than the dawning of morning from night. It is the dawning into manifestation out of non-manifestation, and this happens at each successive stage of the evolutionary process. We should notice also that nothing is said as to the remainder of each day. All that we hear of each day is as the morning, thus indicating the grand truth that when once a divine day opens, it never again descends into the shades of night. It is always morning. The spiritual sun is always climbing higher and higher, but never passes the zenith or commences to decline, a truth which Swedenborg expresses by saying that the spiritual sun is always seen in the eastern heavens at an angle of 45 degrees above the horizon. What a glorious and inspiring truth! When once God begins a work, that work will never cease, but will go on forever expanding into more and more radiant forms of strength and beauty, because it is the expression of the infinite, which is itself love, wisdom, and power. These days of creation are still in their prime, and forever will be so, and the germs of the new heavens and the new earth which the Bible promises are already maturing in the heavens and earth that now are, waiting only, as saint. Paul tells us, for the manifestation of the sons of God, to follow up the old principle of evolution to still further expansion in the glory that shall be revealed. As himself included in the great whole, man is no exception to the universal law of evolution. It has often been remarked that the account of his creation is twofold, the two statements being contained in the first and second chapters of Genesis respectively. But this is precisely in accordance with the method adopted regarding the rest of creation. First, we are told of the creation in the realm of the invisible and psychic, that is to say, the process of involution, and afterwards we are told of the creation on the plane of the concrete and material, that is to say, the process of evolution. And since involution is the cause and evolution the effect, the Bible observes this order both in the account of the creation of the world and in that of the creation of man. In regard to his physical structure, man's body, we are told, is formed from the earth, that is, by a combination of the same material elements as all other concrete forms, and thus, in the physical man, the evolutionary process attains its culmination in the production of a material vehicle capable of serving as the starting point for a further advance, which has now to be made on the plane of the intellectual and spiritual. The principle of evolution is never departed from, but its further action now includes the intelligent cooperation of the evolving individuality itself as a necessary factor in the work. The development of merely animal man is the spontaneous operation of nature, but the development of the mental man can only result from his own recognition of the law of the self-expression of spirit as operating in himself. It is, therefore, for the setting forth of man's power to use this law that the Bible was written, and, accordingly, the great fact on which it seeks to rivet our attention in its first utterance regarding man is that he is made in the image and likeness of God. A very little reflection will show us that this likeness cannot be in the outward form, for the universal spirit in which all things subsist cannot be limited by a shape. It is a principle permeating all things as their innermost substance and vivifying energy. And of it, the Bible tells us that, in the beginning, there was nothing else. Now, the one and only conception we can have of this universal life principle is that of creative power producing infinitely varied expressions of itself by thought. For we cannot ascribe any other initial mode of movement to spirit, but that of thought. Although as taking place in the universal, this mode of thought must necessarily be, relatively to the individual and particular, a subconscious activity. The likeness, therefore, between God and man must be a mental likeness, and since the only fact which, up to this point, the Bible has told us regarding the universal mind is its creative power, the resemblance indicated can only consist in the reproduction of the same creative power in the mind of man. As we progress, we shall find that the whole Bible turns on this one fundamental fact. The creative power is inherent in our thought, and we can by no means divest ourselves of it, but because we are ignorant that we possess this power, or because we misapprehend the conditions for its beneficial employment, we need much instruction in the nature of our own, as yet unrecognized possibilities, and it is the purpose of the Bible to give us this teaching. A little consideration of the terms of the evolutionary process will show us that since there is no other source from which it can proceed, the individual mind, which is the essential entity that we call man, can be no other than a concentration of the universal mind into individual consciousness. Man's mind is, therefore, a miniature reproduction of the divine mind, just as fire has always the same igneous qualities whether the center of combustion be large or small. And so it is on this fact that the Bible would fix our attention from first to last, knowing that if the interior realm of causation be maintained in a harmonious order, the external realm of effects is certain to exhibit corresponding health, happiness, and beauty. And further, if the human mind is the exact image and likeness of the divine, then its creative power must be equally unlimited. Its mode is different, being directed to the individual and particular, but its quality is the same. And this becomes evident if we reflect that it is not possible to set any limit to thought, and that its only limitations are such as are set by the limited conceptions of the individual who thinks. And it is precisely here that the difficulty comes in. Our thought must necessarily be limited by our conceptions. We cannot think of something which we cannot conceive, and, therefore, the more limited our conceptions, the more limited will be our thought, and its creations will accordingly be limited in a corresponding degree. It is for this reason that the ultimate purpose of all true instruction is to lead us into that divine light, where we shall see things beyond the range of any past experiences, things which have not entered into the heart of man to conceive, revealings of the divine spirit opening to us untold worlds of splendor, delight, and unending achievement. But in our earlier stages of development, where we are still surrounded by the mists of ignorance, this correspondence between the range of thought's creations and the range of our conceptions brings about the catastrophe of the fall, which forms the subject of our next chapter. Summary. Creation is not a one-time event in the distant past, but the perpetual movement of spirit into form. The Bible begins with the declaration that God is spirit, and spirit creates through thought. Heaven symbolizes the inner world, earth the outer, and both arise from the same source. Involution, spirit descending into form, precedes evolution, form awakening into consciousness. Humanity mirrors this process, containing body, soul, and spirit. To be made in God's image is to share in the creative power of thought. Key takeaways. Creation is an ongoing process, not history. Spirit manifests through thought and intention. Humanity is a mirror of divine creativity. Action items. Practice seeing your thoughts as seeds of creation. Align inner intention, heaven, with outer action, earth. Begin each day by affirming, I create in harmony with Spirit. Chapter 2. The Fall. In the last chapter, we reached the conclusion that in the nature of things, thought must always be limited by the range of the intelligence which gives rise to it. The power of thought, as the creative agent, is perfectly unlimited in itself, but its action is limited by the particular conception which it is sent forth to embody. If it is a wide conception based upon an enlarged perception of truth, the thought which dwells upon it will produce corresponding conditions. This is self-evident. It is simply the statement that an instrument will not do work to which the hand of the workman does not apply it. And if the student will only fix this very simple idea in his mind, he will find in it the key to the whole mystery of man's power of self-evolution. Let us make our first use of this key to unlock the mystery of the story of Eden. It is hardly necessary to say that the story of Eden is an allegory. That is clearly shown by the nature of the two trees that grew in the center of the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree of life. This allegory is one repeated in many lands and ages, as in the classical fable of the Garden of the Hesperides and in the medieval romance of the Rose. Always the idea is repeated of a garden in whose center grows some life-giving fruit or flower, which is the reward of him who discovers the secret by which the center of the garden may be reached. The meaning in all these stories is the same. The garden is the garden of the soul, and the tree of life is that innermost perception of spirit, of which the Master said that it would be a well of water springing up to everlasting life to all who realized it. It is the garden which elsewhere in Scripture is called the garden of the Lord, and in accordance with the nature of the garden, the plants which grow in it, and which man has to tend and cultivate, are thoughts and ideas. And the chief of them are his idea of life and his idea of knowledge, and these occupy the center of the garden because all our other ideas must take their color from them. We must recollect that human life is a drama whose action takes place in three worlds, and therefore, in reading the Bible, we must always make sure which world we are at any moment reading about: the spiritual, the intellectual, or the physical. In the spiritual world, which is that of the supreme ideal, there exists nothing but the potential of the absolutely perfect. And it is on this account that in the opening chapter of the Bible we read that God saw that all his work was good, the divine eye could find no flaw anywhere. And we should note carefully that this absolutely good creation included man also. But as soon as we descend to the intellectual world, which is the world of man's conception of things, it is quite different. And until man comes to realize the truly spiritual, and therefore perfectly good, essential nature of all things, there is room for any amount of misconception, resulting in a corresponding misdirection of man's creative instrument of thought, which thus produces correspondingly misformed realities. Now, the perfect life of Adam and Eve in Eden is the picture of man as he exists in the spiritual world. It is not the tradition of some bygone age, but a symbolical representation of what we all are in our innermost being, thus recalling the words of the Master recorded in the Gospel of the Egyptians. He was asked when the kingdom of heaven should come, and replied, "When that which is without shall be as that which is within." In other words, when the perfection of the innermost spiritual essence shall be reproduced in the external part. In the story of man's pristine life of innocence and joy in paradise, we are reading on the level of the highest of the three worlds. The story of the fall brings us to the envelopment of this spiritual nature in the lower intellectual and material natures, through which alone it can obtain perfect individualization and man become a reality instead of remaining only a divine dream. In the allegory, man is warned by God that death will be the consequence of eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is not the threat of a sentence to be passed by God, but a warning as to the nature of the fruit itself. But this warning is disregarded by Eve, and she shares the forbidden fruit with Adam, and they are both expelled from Eden and become subject to death as the consequence. Now, if Eden is the garden of the soul, it is clear that Adam and Eve cannot be separate personages, but must be two principles in the human individuality which are so closely united as to be represented by a wedded pair. What, then, are these principles? St. Paul makes a very remarkable statement regarding Adam and Eve. He tells us that Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. 1 Timothy 2:14. We have, therefore, Bible warrant for saying that Adam was not deceived, but at the same time the story of the fall clearly shows that he was expelled from Eden from partaking of the fruit at Eve's instigation. To satisfy both statements, therefore, we require to find in Adam and Eve two principles, one of which is capable of being deceived and is deceived, and falls in consequence of the deception, and the other of which is incapable of being deceived, but yet is involved in the fall of the former. This is the problem which has to be worked out, and the names of Adam and Eve supply the solution. Eve, we are told, was so called because she was the mother of all living, Genesis 3:20. Eve, then, is the mother of life, a subject to which I shall have to refer again, by and by. Eve, both syllables being pronounced, is the same word which in some Oriental languages is written Hawa, by which name she is called in the Quran, and signifies breath, the principle which we are told in Genesis 2:7 constitutes man a living soul. Adam is rendered in the margin of the Bible earth, or red earth, and according to another derivation, the name may also be rendered as not breath. And thus, in these two names we have the description of two principles, one of which is breath and life-conveying, while the other is not breath and is nothing but earth. It requires no great skill to recognize in these the soul and the body. Then St. Paul's meaning becomes clear. Any work on physiology will tell you that the human body is made up of certain chemical materials, so much chalk, so much carbon, so much water, etc., etc. Obviously, these substances cannot be deceived because they have no intelligence, and any deception that occurs must be accepted by the soul or intellectual principle, which is Eve, the mother of the individual life. New Thought readers will have no difficulty in following the meaning of the poet Spenser when he says, "For of the soul the body form doth take, for soul is form, and doth the body make. And since the soul is the builder of the body, the deception which causes wrong thinking on the part of the intellectual man reproduces itself in physical imperfection and in adverse external circumstances. What, then, is the deception which causes the fall? This is figured by the serpent. The serpent is a very favorite emblem in all ancient esoteric literature and symbolism, and is sometimes used in a positive and sometimes in a negative sense. In either case, it means life, not the originating life principle, but the ultimate outcome of that life principle in its most external form of manifestation. This, of course, is not bad in itself. Recognized in full realization of the fact that it comes from God, it is the completion of the divine work by outward manifestation, and in this sense it becomes the serpent which Moses lifted up in the wilderness. But without the recognition of it as the ultimate mode of the divine spirit, which is all that is, it becomes the deadly reptile, not lifted up, but crawling flat upon the ground. It is that ignorant conception of things which cannot see the spiritual element in them, and therefore attributes all their energy of action and reaction to themselves, not perceiving that they are the creations of a higher power. Ignorant of the divine law of creation, we do not look beyond secondary causes. And therefore, because our own creative thought power is ever externalizing conditions representative of our conceptions, we necessarily become more and more involved in the meshes of a network of circumstances from which we can find no way of escape. How these circumstances come about, we cannot tell. We may call it blind chance, or iron destiny, or inscrutable providence. But because we are ignorant of the true law of primary causation, we never suspect the real fact, which is that the originating power of all this inharmony is ourself. This is the great deception. We believe the serpent, or that conception of life which sees nothing beyond secondary causation, and consequently we accept the knowledge of evil as being equally necessary with the knowledge of good, and so we eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and of evil. It is this dual aspect of knowledge that is deadly, but knowledge itself is nowhere condemned in Scripture. On the contrary, it is repeatedly stated to be the foundation of all progress. Wisdom is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, says the book of Proverbs. Salvation is of the Jews because we know what we worship, says Jesus, and so on throughout the Bible. But what is deadly to the soul of man is the conception that evil is a subject of knowledge as well as good. For this reason, that by thinking of evil as a subject to be studied, we thereby attribute to it a substantive existence of its own. In other words, we look upon it as something having a self-originating power, which, as we advance in our studies, we shall find more and more clearly is not the case. And so, by the law of the creative working of thought, we bring the evil into existence. We have not yet penetrated the great secret of the difference between causes and conditions. But this knowledge of our thought action is not reached in the earlier history of the race or of the individual, for the simple reason that all evolution takes place by growth, and consequently, the history of Adam and Eve in realization, that is the external life of humanity, as distinguished from our simultaneous existence on the supreme plane of spirit, commences with their expulsion from Eden and their conflict with a world of sorrows and difficulties. If the reader realizes how this expulsion results from the soul accepting evil as a subject of knowledge, he will now be able to understand certain further facts. We are told that the Lord God said, "Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. The Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden." Genesis 3:22. Looked at superficially, this seems like jealousy that man should have attained the same knowledge as God, and fear lest he should take the further step that would make him altogether God's equal. But such a reading of the text is babyish, and indicates no conception of God as universal all-originating spirit, and we must therefore look for some deeper interpretation. The first commandment is the recognition of the divine unity, a fact on which Jesus laid special emphasis when he was asked which was the chief commandment of the law, and the purpose is to guard us against the root error from which all other forms of error spring. If the mathematical statement of truth is that God is one, then the mathematical expression of error is that God is zero, and as the latter position has sometimes been taken by teachers of reputation, it may be well to show the student where the fallacy lies. The conclusion that the mathematical expression for God is zero is reached in this way. As soon as you can conceive of anything as being, you can also conceive of it as not being. In other words, the conception of any positive implies also the conception of its corresponding negative. Consequently, the conception of the positive or of the negative by itself is only half the conception, and a whole conception implies the recognition of both. Therefore, since God contains the all, he must contain the negative as well as the positive of all potentiality, and the equal balance of positive and negative is zero. But the radical error of this argument is the assumption that it is possible for two principles to neutralize each other, one of which is, and the other of which is not. We find the principle of neutralization by means of equilibration throughout nature, but the equilibration is always between two things each of which actually exists. Thus in chemistry, we find an acid exactly equilibrating an alkali and producing a neutral substance which is neither acid nor alkali. But this is because the acid and the alkali both really exist. Each of them is something that is. But what should we say to a chemical formula which required us to produce a neutral substance by equilibrating an acid which did exist by an alkali which did not? Yet this is precisely the sort of equilibration we are asked to accept by those who would make zero the mathematical expression of all originating being. They say that a universal principle which is exactly balanced by a universal principle which is not. They affirm that nothing is the equivalent of something. This is mere juggling with words and figures, and willfully shutting our eyes to the fact that the only quality of nothing is nothingness. Can anything be plainer than the old philosophic dictum, ex nihilo nihil fit? Nothing is made out of nothing. Disintegrating forces there are in nature, but they do not proceed out of nothing. They are the one positive power acting at lower levels, not the absence of the one universal energy, but that same energy working with less complex concentration and specific purpose than when directed by those higher modes of itself, which constitute individual intelligences. There is no such thing as a negative power, in the sense of power which is not the one all-originating power. All energy is some mode of manifestation of the one, and it is always making something, though in doing so it may unmake something else. And what we loosely speak of as negative forces are the operation of the cosmical law of transition from one form to another. Above this, there is a higher law, to lead us to the realization of which is the whole object of the Bible, and that is the law of individual selection. It does not do away with the law of transition, for without transition there could be no evolution, and the glory of eternal life is in continuous evolution. But it substitutes the individual law of conscious life for the impersonal cosmic law, and effects transition by living processes of assimilation and readjustment, which more perfectly build up the individuality instead of by a process of unbalanced disintegration which would destroy it. This is the living law of liberty, which at every stage of its progress makes us, not less, but more and yet more ourselves. It is for this reason that the Bible so strongly insists upon the mathematical statement that God is one, and in fact makes this the basis of all that it has to say. God is life, expression, reality. And how can these things comport with nothingness? All we can know of any invisible power is through the effects we see it produce. Of electricity and chemical attraction, it may be truly said that no man hath seen them or can see them. Yet we know them by their working, and we rightly argue that if they work, they exist. The same argument applies to the divine spirit. It is that which is, and not that which is not. And therefore I ask the student who would realize reality and not nothingness, once for all to convince himself of the fallaciousness of the argument that the divine being is not being, or that naught is the same thing as one. If he starts his search for reality by assuming what contradicts mathematics and common sense, he can never expect to find reality, for he has denied its existence at the very outset, and carries that initial denial all the way along with him. But if he realizes that all relations, whether relatively positive or negative, must necessarily be relations between factors which actually exist, and that there can be no relation with nothing, then, because he has assumed reality in his premises, he will eventually find it in his conclusions, and will learn that the great reality is the one expressing itself as the many, and the many recognizing themselves in the one. The more advanced student will have no difficulty in recognizing the particular schools of teaching to which these remarks apply. Their mathematics are unassailable, but the assumptions on which they make their selection of terms in the first instance are totally inapplicable to the subject matter to which they apply them, for that subject is life in itself. Now, the deception into which Eve falls is mathematically represented by saying that God equals zero, and thus attributing to evil the same self-existence as to good. There is no such thing as absolute evil, and what we recognize as evil is the one good power working as disintegrating force, because we have not yet learnt to direct it in such a way that it shall perform the functions of transition to higher degrees of life without any disintegration of our individuality either in person or circumstances. It is this disintegrating action that makes the one power appear evil relatively to ourselves. And, so long as we conceive ourselves thus related to it, it does look as though it were zero balancing in itself the two opposite forces of life and death, good and evil. And it is in this sense that God is said to know both. But this is a conception very different to that of the all-productive One, and arises not from the true nature of being, but from our own confused thought. But because the action of our thought is always creative, the mere fact of our regarding evil as an affirmative force in itself makes it so relatively to ourselves. And therefore, no sooner do we fear evil than we begin to create the evil that we fear. To extinguish evil, we must learn not to fear it, and that means to cease recognizing it as having any power of its own. And so our salvation comes from realizing that in truth there is nothing but the good. But this knowledge can only be attained through long experience, which will at last bring man to the place where he is able to deduce truth from a priori principles, and to learn that his past experiences of evil have proceeded from his own inverted conceptions, and are not founded upon truth, but upon its opposite. If then it were possible for him to attain the knowledge which would enable him to live forever before gaining this experience, the result would be an immortality of misery, and therefore the law of nature renders it impossible for him to reach the knowledge which would place immortality within his grasp, until he has gained that deep insight into the true working of causation, which is necessary to make eternal life a prize worth having. For these reasons, man is represented as being expelled from Eden, lest he should eat of the tree of life and live forever. Before quitting this subject, we must glance briefly at the sentences pronounced upon the man, the woman, and the serpent. The serpent in this connection, being the principle of error, which results in death, can never come into any sort of reconciliation with the divine spirit, which is truth and life, and, therefore, the only possible pronouncement upon the serpent is a curse, that is, a sentence of destruction. And the Bible goes on to show the stages by which this destruction is ultimately worked out. The penalty to Adam, or the corporeal body, is that of having to earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, that is, by toilsome labor, which would not be necessary if the true law of the creative exercise of our thought were understood. The woman passes under a painful physiological law, but at the same time, final deliverance and restoration from the fall is promised through her instrumentality. Her seed shall crush the serpent's head, that is, shall utterly destroy that false principle which the serpent represents. Since the woman is the soul, or individual mind, her progeny must be thoughts and ideas. New ideas are not brought forth easily. They are the result of painful experiences and of long mental labor, and thus the physiological analogy contained in the text exactly illustrates the birth of new ideas into the world. And as the evolution of the soul proceeds toward higher and higher intelligence, there is a corresponding increase in the life-ward tendency of its ideas, and thus there is enmity between the seed of the woman, or the enlightened conception of the principles of life, and the seed of the serpent, or the opposite and unenlightened conception. This is the same warfare which we find in Revelations between the woman and the dragon. But in the end, the victory remains with the woman and her seed. During the progress of the struggle, the serpent must bruise the heel of the divine seed, that is to say, must impede and retard the progress of truth on the earth. But truth must conquer at last and crush the serpent's head, so that it shall never rise up again forever. The seed of the woman, the fruit of the spiritually enlightened mind, which must at last achieve the final victory, is that supreme ideal which is the recognition of man's divine sonship. It is the realization of the fact that he is, indeed, the image and likeness of God. This is the truth, the knowledge of which Jesus said would set us free, and each one who attains to this knowledge realizes that he is at once the Son of Man and the Son of God. Thus the story of the fall contains also the statement of the principle of the rising again. It is the history of the human race, because it is first the history of the individual soul. And to each one of us the ancient wisdom says, De te fabula narratur. These opening chapters of Genesis are, therefore, an epitome of all that the Bible afterwards unfolds in fuller detail, and the whole may be summed up in the following terms. The great truth concerning man is that he is the image and likeness of God. Man is at first ignorant of this truth, and this ignorance is his fall. Man at last comes to the perfect knowledge of this truth, and this knowledge is his rising again. And these principles will expand until they bring us to the full expression of the life that is in us, in all the glories of the heavenly Jerusalem. Summary. The fall symbolizes humanity's misuse of thought and the acceptance of separation. Adam and Eve represent principles within us, the body and the soul. The serpent is the deceptive belief in duality, suggesting that evil is as real as good. By accepting this, humanity fell from unity into division, and suffering followed. Yet the fall also contains the seed of rising again, for through experience we learn the truth of unity. The fall is not permanent, it is the beginning of awakening. Key takeaways. The fall is inner, not historical. Error arises when we believe evil has independent power. Every fall contains the principle of restoration. Action items. Notice when fear or duality dominates your thinking. Refuse to grant evil any self-existent reality. Replace thoughts of division with affirmations of unity. Chapter 3. Israel. The space at my disposal will allow me only to touch upon a few of the most conspicuous points in that portion of the Bible narrative which takes us from the story of Eden to the mission of Moses, for the reader will kindly bear in mind that I am not writing a commentary on the whole Bible, but only a brief introduction to its study. The episode of Cain and Abel will be dealt with in the next chapter, and I will therefore pass on at once to the deluge. As most of my readers probably know, this story is not confined to the Jewish and Christian scriptures, but is met with in one form or another in all the most ancient traditions of the world, and this universal consensus of mankind leaves no doubt of the occurrence of some overwhelming cataclysm which has indelibly stamped itself upon the memory of all nations. Whether science will ever succeed in working out the problem of its extent and of the physical conditions that gave rise to it remains to be seen, but it does not appear unreasonable to associate it with the tradition handed down to us by Plato of the sinking of the great continent of Atlantis, which is said to have once occupied the area now covered by the Atlantic Ocean. I am well aware that some geologists dispute the possibility of any radical changes having ever taken place in the distribution of the land and water surfaces of the globe, but there are at least equally good opinions on the other side. And if there is any fact in the world's history regarding which tradition is unanimous, it is the catastrophe of the deluge. And here I would draw attention to the fact that the Bible specially warns us against the opinion that no such catastrophe ever took place, and points out this opinion as one of the signs of the time of the end, speaking of it as determined ignorance, and telling us that a similar catastrophe, only by fire instead of water, will at some future period overwhelm the existing world, 2 Peter 3. And I would add that the possible conditions for such an event may not unreasonably be inferred from certain facts in the science of astronomy. It is not my present purpose, however, to enter into the scientific and historical aspects of the deluge tradition, but to point out its significance in that inner meaning of the Bible which I wish the student to grasp. In the story as handed down by all nations, the deluge is attributed to the wickedness of mankind, and according to some very ancient traditions, this wickedness took largely the form of sorcery, a word which may perhaps provoke a smile in the uninitiated reader, but which holds a conspicuous place in the list of those causes which in the book of Revelations are enumerated as leading to exclusion from the heavenly city. And it will become sufficiently clear why it should do so when we learn what it really means. Coupling this tradition with the symbolical significance of water, a deluge would indicate a total submergence in a psychic environment which had become too powerful to be held under control. The psychic world is an integral part of the universe, and the psychic element is an integral part of man. And it is in this circulus that we find the plastic material which forms the nucleus for those attractions which eventually consolidate as external facts. The psychic realm is therefore the realm of tremendous potentialities, and the deeper our knowledge of its laws, the greater we see to be the need for bringing these potentialities under a higher control. Now, the opening verses of Genesis have shown us that water, without the movement of the Spirit, is darkness and the abode of chaos. The movement of the Spirit is the only power that can control the turbulence of the waters and bring them into that harmonious action which will result in forms of life, beauty, and peace. And in the world of man's mind, this movement of the Spirit upon the waters takes place exactly in proportion as the individual recognizes the true nature of the divine Spirit and wills to reflect its image and likeness. Where this recognition takes place, the psychic forces are brought under the control of a harmonizing power which, reflecting itself into them, can only produce that which is good and beautiful on a small scale at first because of our infantine knowledge of the powers with which we are dealing, but continually growing with our growth until the whole psychic world opens out before us as a limitless realm filled with the glory of God and the love of man, and the shapes of beauty to which these give rise. But if a man forces his way into that realm on no other basis than his individual strength of will, he does so without reckoning that his will is itself a product of the psychic plane, and only one among untold organized entities and unorganized forces which sooner or later will overpower him and hurry him to age-long destruction. Age-long, for I use the Bible word aionios, which, as the learned Farrar has shown in his Eternal Hope, does not mean absolutely endless. Yet, if we reflect what may be included in this word, infinite periods perhaps of withdrawal and renewal of our whole planetary system, we may well stand aghast at such prodigious ruin. But if such dangers are in it, may we not say that we will have nothing to do with the psychic realm? No, for by our nature we are always immersed in it. It is within us, and we are, and always must be, inhabitants of it, and we are always unconsciously using its forces and being reacted upon by them. What we need, therefore, is not to escape from what is an essential part of our nature, but to learn to vivify this otherwise dark realm with the warmth of divine love and the illumination of divine light. But the Bible tells how very far the antediluvian world was from recognizing these divine principles, for the earth was filled with violence, and, except in the family of Noah, the true worship of God had ceased among men. And remark this word violence as the summing up of human iniquity. Violence is the clashing of individual wills not harmonized by the recognition of any unifying principle. The oneness of the Spirit, from which all individualization proceeds, is entirely lost sight of, and each for himself becomes the ruling principle, a principle which cannot but result in violence under whatever disguise it may be masked for a time. The earth filled with violence was the outward correspondence of the inward mental state of the masses of mankind, and we may, therefore, well imagine what the nature of their operations in the symbolic world of water must have been. This state of things had been growing for generations, until at last the inevitable result arrived, and the moral deluge produced its correspondence in the physical world. The uninstructed reader will doubtless smile at my reference to a psychic environment, but those who have obtained at least some glimpses beyond the threshold will see the force of my argument when I direct their attention to the signs of a recurrence of a similar state of things at the present day. Research in various directions is making clearer and clearer the reality of the psychic forces, and increasing numbers are beginning to get some measure of practical insight into them. And while I rejoice to say, we see that for the most part, these opening powers are being employed under the direction of sincere religious feeling and with charitable intention, yet there are not wanting reports of opposite uses, and this in connection with specific localities where the inverted employment of these great powers is secretly practiced according to methodized system. I cannot too strongly warn the student against any connection with such societies, and their existence is a terrible comment upon the Master's description of the latter days, which, he expressly tells us, will reproduce the character of those which immediately preceded the flood. The sole safeguard is in recognizing the divine spirit as the only source of power, and in regarding every action, whether of thought, word, or deed, as being in its form and measure an act of divine worship. This is what St. Paul means when he says, "Pray without ceasing." What needs to be cultivated is the habitual mental attitude that leads us to see God in all things, and it is for this reason that the foundation of conscious spiritual life is that first commandment to the consideration of which we are approaching. It was, therefore, in consequence of their entire denial of the divine spirit that the antediluvians raised up an adverse power which at last became too strong for them to control. And here let me, once for all, set the student right with regard to those passages of the Bible in which God is represented as making up his mind to inflict injury, as in the announcement of the impending deluge. These expressions are figurative. They represent the entrance upon the scene of that cosmic law of disintegration which necessarily comes into play as soon as the highest directing power of intelligence is inhibited, and therefore, as soon as a man willfully thrusts from him the recognition of the universal spirit in its higher manifestations as the guardian and the guide, he, ipso facto, calls it into action in its lower manifestations as the universal cosmic force. The reason for this will appear more clearly from a careful study of the relations between the personal and the impersonal modes of spirit, but the explanation of these relations would occupy too large a space to be entered upon here, and the reader must be referred to other works on the subject. In the present connection, it is sufficient to say that we can never get rid of God, for we ourselves are manifestations of his being, and if we will not have him as the good, we shall be compelled to accept it as the evil. This is what the Master meant when he said in the parable that, on the Lord's return to his city, he ordered those who would not accept him to reign over them to be slain before him. Noah and his 3 sons are rescued from the universal overthrow by means of the ark. As I am concerned in the present book with the inner meaning of the Bible, rather than with the historical facts, I must leave the reader to form his own conclusions regarding the literal measurements of that vessel, but I would take this opportunity of observing that where distinct numbers and measurements are given in the Bible, they are not introduced at haphazard. From the standpoint of ordinary arithmetic, they may seem to be so, and the main argument of Bishop Colenso's great work on the Pentateuch is based on these apparent discrepancies. For instance, speaking of the sacrifices to be offered for women after childbirth, he points out that during the march through the desert, these could, according to the text, only be offered by Aaron and his 2 sons, and that calculated on ordinary averages, the offering of these sacrifices would have occupied each of these 3 priests 14 hours a day, without 1 moment's rest or intermission. Volume 1, 123. From the point of view of simple arithmetic, this result is unavoidable, but I cannot endorse the bishop's conclusion that the scribes who wrote the Pentateuch under the direction of Ezra introduced any numbers that occurred to them without considering how they would work out. On the contrary, such investigation as I have been able to make into the subject convinces me that the Bible numbers are calculated with the most rigid accuracy and with the very deepest thought of the results to which they will work out. Only this is done according to a certain symbolic system known as sacred numeration. And the very impracticability of the figures when tested by ordinary arithmetic is intended to put us upon inquiry for some deeper meaning below the surface. To explain the principles of sacred numeration would be beyond the scope of an elementary book like the present, and probably few readers would care to undertake the requisite amount of study. But we must not suppose that the numbers given in the Bible are without significance, whenever ordinary methods of calculation fail to elucidate them. The whole meaning of Scripture is not upon the surface, and in the present connection we are expressly pointed to a symbolic signification in 1 Peter chapter 3, 20-21. And the recurrence of the ark as a sacred emblem in the great race religions clearly indicates it as representing some universal principle. The Zoroastrian legend of the flood throws some light upon the subject, for Yima, the Persian Noah, is bidden by Ahura Mazda, the deity, to bring the seeds of sheep, oxen, men and women, dogs and birds, and of every kind of tree and fruit, 2 of every kind, into the ark, and to seal it up with a golden ring and make in it a door and a window. The significance of the ark is that of a vehicle for the transmission of the life principle of beings from an old to a new order of life, and all that is not included in the ark perishes. This is the generalized statement of relations which the ark sets forth, and, like all other generalizations, it admits of a great many particular applications, ranging from those which are purely physiological to those which are in the highest degree spiritual, and the study of comparative religions will show us that the idea has been employed in all its most varied applications. Yet, however varied, they all have this common feature that they signify something which conveys individual life safely through a period of transition from one order of manifestation to another. The ark, as the sacred vessel, plays a conspicuous part throughout Scripture, but in the present connection we shall best realize its meaning by considering it as the opposite principle to that from which it affords deliverance. If water signifies the psychic principle, then the ark signifies that which the psychic principle supports, and which has an opposite but correspondent nature, that is to say, the body. The ark is not independent of the water, but is constructed for the purpose of floating upon it, and similarly, the body is expressly adapted to man's psychic nature, so as to make with it, and the spiritual principle of life, a whole individuality. Now, it is precisely in the recognition of this wholeness that refuge from all psychic entanglements is to be found. We must always remember that the body, equally with the soul, is the instrument of the manifestation of the Spirit. It is the union of the three into a single whole that constitutes the full reality of life, and it is this sacredness of the body that is typified by the sacredness of the ark. The Ark of Noah was a solid construction, built on a pattern all the details of which were laid down to scale by the divine architect, and thus exemplifies the accurate proportions of the human body. And in passing, it may interest the reader to note that the proportions of the human body numerically represent the principal measurements of the solar system, and also form the basis of the proportions observed in such ecclesiastical architecture as is designed according to canonical rules, of which Westminster Abbey and Milan Cathedral are good examples. I cannot, however, stop to digress into this very interesting subject, and for our present purpose it will be sufficient to say that the ark with its living freight is typical of the fact that the full realization of life is only attained in the threefold unity of body, soul, and spirit, and not by their dissociation. It is the assertion of the solid, living reality of the work of the Spirit, as distinguished from those imperfect manifestations which are the subterranean roots of the true manifestation, but are not the real solid thing itself. It is the protest of healthy reality, which includes the psychic element in its proper order as the intermediary between the purely spiritual and the purely material, as against the rejection of the corporeal element and total absorption in the psychic, a condition which prevents the spirit from attaining to self-expression as a synthesis, which alone is the completion of its evolutionary work. For this reason, undue absorption in the psychic sphere is contrary to the spirit, and however we may apply to it the word spiritual in the sense of not being corporeal, if the psychic element is not taken in its proper connection with the two others. It is as far from being spiritual in the true sense of the word as the material element itself. The true reality is in the harmonious interaction of the three in one. God's world is a world of truth, in which evanescent shapes do not take the place of reality. And for these reasons, the Bible everywhere insists on nothing short of the fullness of perfect realization. And the ark is one of the figures under which it does so. This realization of the triple unity of man is the first step towards our final enfranchisement. But in the very act of escaping from the danger of the deluge, we are exposed to a danger of the opposite kind, that of regarding the corporeal side of life as everything. And this is typified by the building of the Tower of Babel. This tower, note carefully, was built of brick, that is, of a substance which is nothing but clay, the same red earth out of which Adam is formed, and it is therefore the very opposite to the heavenly Jerusalem, which is built of gold and precious stones. Now, a building naturally signifies a habitation, and the building of the Tower of Babel to escape the waters of a flood is that reaction against the psychic element, which denies spiritual things altogether, and makes of the body and its physical environment the one and only dwelling place of man. It is the same error as before of trying to erect the edifice of wholeness on the foundation merely of a part, only now the part selected is the corporeal instead of the psychic. Arithmetically, it is the attempt to make out that 1/3 is the same as 1. The natural consequences soon follow in the confusion of tongues. Language is the expression of thought, and if our ideas of reality include nothing more than the infinitude of secondary causes which appear in the material world, there is no central unit around which they can be grouped, and consequently, instead of any certain knowledge, we have only a multitude of conflicting opinions based upon the ever-changing aspects of the world of appearances. Quot homines tot sententiae, and so the builders are dispersed in confusion, for theirs is not the city that hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. From this point in the Bible story, a stretch of many ages brings us to the times of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are here in the transition stage from allegory to history and saint. Paul points out this intermingling of the two elements when he tells us that Hagar and Sarah represent the two covenants and the earthly and heavenly Jerusalems. And here I would impress upon the student the dual character of scriptural personages and events. Because a personage or event is typical, it does not follow that it is not also historical. On the contrary, certain personages, systems, and events become typical, that is, specially emphasize certain principles, for the very reason that they give them concrete expression. As Johnson says of the Swedish monarch, "He left the name at which the world grew pale, to point a moral or adorn a tale." In other words, historical realities become the very summing up and visible form of abstract principles, and therefore we are justified by the Bible itself in finding in its personages types of principles as well as historical characters. I will not, however, here open the question whether the three patriarchs were actual personages, or, as some critics tell us, were merely the legendary ancestors of certain groups of wandering tribes, the Beni Ibrahim, the Beni Ishak, and the Beni Yaqub, which subsequently coalesced into the Hebrew nation. However interesting, the discussion of the historical facts would be remote from my present object, which is to throw some light upon the inner meaning of the Bible, and for this purpose we may be content to take the simple narrative of the text, for, whether actual or legendary, the only way in which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can affect us at the present day is as characters in a history, the significance of which will become clear if we read between the lines. But from this latter point of view, the biblical statement of the national origin of Israel carries enfolded within it the hidden statement of those great principles which it is the purpose of the Bible to reveal. And here let me draw attention to the method adopted in Scripture. There are certain great universal principles which permeate all planes of being from the highest to the lowest. They are not many in number, and the relations between them are not difficult of comprehension when clearly stated, but we find difficulty in recognizing the identity of the same principles when we meet with them, so to say, at different levels, as for example on the physical and the psychic planes respectively. And consequently, we are apt to imagine them much more numerous and complicated than they really are. Now, the purpose of the Bible is to convey instruction in the nature and use of these principles to those in whose hands this knowledge would be safe and useful, while concealing it from others, and in a manner appropriate to this object, it continually repeats the same few all-embracing principles over and over and over again. This repetition is firstly unavoidable, because the principles themselves are few in number. Next, it is necessary as a process of hammering in and fixing it in our minds. And lastly, it is not a bare repetition, but there is a progressive expansion of the statement so as to conduct us step by step to a further comprehension of its meaning. Now, this is done in a variety of ways, and one of frequent occurrence is through the use of names. Sacred nomenclature is as large a study as sacred numeration, and indeed, the two so shade off into one another that they may be regarded as forming a single study, and I will therefore no more attempt in the present book to elucidate the one system than the other, for they require a volume to themselves. But this need not prevent us considering occasional instances of both, and the names of the patriarchs are too important to be passed over without notice. The frequency with which God is called in Scripture, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, shows that something more must be referred to than the mere fact that the ancestors of the Jews worshipped him, and the consideration of some of the prominent points in the history of these allegorical personages will throw a light on the subject which will be very helpful in our further investigations. If we realize the truth of St. Paul's statement that the real object of the Bible is to convey the history of the spiritual Israel under the figure of Israel after the flesh, we shall see that the descent of Israel from the three patriarchs must be a spiritual descent, and we may therefore expect to find in the patriarchs themselves an adumbration of the principles which give rise to the spiritual Israel. Now, we should particularly notice that the name Israel was bestowed on Jacob, the third patriarch, on the occasion when he wrestled with the angel at the ford Jabbok, and he obtained this name as the result of his successful wrestling. We are told that Jacob recognized that it was the divine being, the nameless one, with whom he wrestled. And this at once gives us the key to the allegory. For we know from the Master's instruction to the woman of Samaria that God is universal spirit, and though the universal is that which gives rise to all manifestations of the particular, yet it is logically and mathematically impossible for the universal as such to assume individual personality. Under the figure, therefore, of wrestling with a man, we perceive that what Jacob wrestled with was the great problem of his own relation to the universal spirit under its twofold aspect of universal energy and universal intelligence, allegorically represented as a powerful man. And he held on and wrestled till he gained the blessing, and the new name in which the nature of that blessing was summed up. The conditions are significant. He was alone. Father of a large family as he was, none of his dear ones could help him in the struggle. We must each solve the problem of our relation to the infinite mind for ourselves, and not our nearest and dearest can wrestle for us. And the struggle takes place in the darkness. It is when we begin to find that the light we thought we possessed is not the true light, when we find that its illuminating power is gone, that we rise nerved with an energy we never knew before, and commence in earnest the struggle for the light, determined never to let go until we win the victory. And so we wrestle till the day begins to break. But even then we must not quit our hold. We must not be content until we have received the new name which marks our possession of that principle of light and life, which will forever expand into brighter day and fuller livingness. To him, that overcometh will I give a new name. Revelation 2:17. But Jacob carries with him the mark of the struggle throughout his earthly career. The angel touched the hollow of his thigh, and thenceforward he was lame. The meaning is simple enough to those who have had some experience of the wrestling. They can never again walk in earthly things with the same step as before. They have seen the truth, and they can never again unsee it. Their whole standpoint has been altered, and is no longer understood by those around them. To those who have not wrestled with the angel, they appear to walk lamely. What, then, was the new name that was thus gained by the resolute wrestler? His original name of Jacob was changed to Israel. The definition given of Israel in the 73rd Psalm is such as are of a clean heart. And Jesus expressed the same idea when he said of Nathanael, "Behold an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." For the emphasis laid upon the word Israelite at once suggests some inner meaning, since Nathanael's nationality was no more remarkable under the circumstances than that of an Englishman in Piccadilly. The great fact about the spiritual Israel is therefore cleanness of heart and absence of guile, in other words, perfect sincerity, which again implies singleness of purpose in the right direction. It is precisely that quality which our Buddhist friends call one-pointedness, and on which, under various similitudes, the Master laid so much stress. This, then, is the distinctive characteristic which attaches to the name of Israel, for it is this concentration of effort that is the prime factor in gaining the victory which leads to the acquisition of the name. This is fundamental, and without it nothing can be accomplished. It indicates the sort of mental character which we must aim at, but it is not the meaning of the name itself. The name of Israel is composed of 3 syllables, each of which carries a great meaning. The first syllable is primarily the sound of the indrawing of the breath, and hence acquires the significance of the life principle in general, and more particularly of individual life. This recognition of the individualization of the life principle formed the basis of the Assyrian worship. The syllable is was also rendered as, ish, and ash, and gave rise to the worship of the life principle under the plural name Asher, which thus represented the male and female elements, the former being worshipped as Asher or Aser, and the latter as Ashrei, Ashira, Astarte, Yastara, or Ishtar, and lunar goddess of Babylon, and the same idea of femininity is found in the Egyptian Isis. Hence the general conception conveyed by the syllable is that of a feminine spiritual principle manifesting itself in individuality, that is to say, the soul, or formative element, and it is thus indicative of all that we mean when we speak of the psychic side of nature. How completely the Assyrians identified themselves with the cultus of this principle is shown by the name of their country, which is derived from Ashur. The second syllable, Ra, is the name of the great Egyptian sun god, and is thus the complementary of everything that is signified by is. It is primarily indicative of physical life rather than psychic life, and in general represents the universal life-giving power as distinguished from its manifestation in particular individuality. Ra symbolizes the sun, while is symbolized by the moon, and represents the masculine element as emphatically as is represents the feminine. The third syllable, El, has the significance of universal being. It is the, i.e., the nameless principle, which includes in itself both the masculine and feminine elements, both the physical and the psychic, and is greater than them and gives rise to them. It is another form of the word al, ale, or Allah, which means high, and is indicative of the supreme principle before it passes into any differentiated mode. It is pure spirit in the universal. Now, if man is to attain liberty, it can only be by the realization of these 3 modes of being, the physical, the psychic, and the spiritual, or, as the Bible expresses it, body, soul, and spirit. He must know what these 3 are in himself, and must also recognize the source from which they spring. and he must at least have some moderately definite idea of their genesis into individuality. Therefore, the man instructed unto the kingdom of heaven combines a threefold recognition of himself and of God, which is accurately represented by the combination of the three syllables is, Ra, and El. Unless these three are joined into a single unity, a single word, the recognition is incomplete and the full knowledge of truth has not been attained. Ra, by itself, implies only the knowledge of the physical world and results in materialism. Is, by itself, realizes only the psychic world and results in sorcery. El, by itself, corresponds only with a vague apprehension of some overruling power, capricious and devoid of the element of law, and thus results in idolatry. It is only in the combination of all three elements that the true reality is to be found, whether we study it in its physical, psychic, or spiritual aspect. We may, for particular purposes, give special prominence to one aspect over the two others, but this is for a time only. And even while we do so, we realize that the particular mode of life power with which we are dealing derives its efficiency only from the fact of its being permeated by the other two. We cannot too firmly impress upon our minds that, though there are three modes, there is only one life. And in all our studies, and in their practical application, we must never forget the great truth that the living power which we use is a synthesis, and that whenever we make an analysis, we theoretically destroy the synthesis. The only purpose of making an analysis is to learn how to build up the synthesis. And it is for this reason that the Bible equally condemns the opposite extremes of materialism and sorcery. It tells us that dogs and sorcerers are excluded from the heavenly city. And when we understand what is meant by these terms, it becomes self-evident that it cannot be otherwise. It is for this reason also that we find the Israelites so often warned both against the Babylonian and the Egyptian idolatries, not because there was no great underlying truth in the worship of those nations, but because it was a worship that excluded the idea of wholeness. Wilt thou be made whole is the divine invitation to us all, and the Egyptian and Assyrian worships were eminently calculated to lead their votaries away from this wholeness in opposite directions. But that both the Assyrian and the Egyptian worship had a solid basis of truth is a fact to which the Bible itself bears this remarkable testimony. In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel mine inheritance. Isaiah 19:24. The Israelite worship was as essentially that of the principle represented by El as those of Egypt and Assyria were of the two others, and it needed the balancing of those two extremes by the recognition of their relation to the central or spiritual principle to constitute the realization of the true divine sonship of man, in which no element of his threefold being, body, soul, or spirit, is alien from unity with the Father. This, then, was the significance of the new name given to Jacob. He had wrestled with the divine until the light had begun to dawn upon him, and he thus acquired the right to a name which should correctly describe what he had now become. Formerly, he had been Jacob, i.e., Yakub, a name derived from the root yak, or one. This signifies the third stage of apprehension of the divine problem, which immediately precedes the final discovery of the great secret of the Trinity in unity of being. We realize the oneness of the universal divine principle, though we have not yet realized its threefold nature, both in ourselves and in the universal. But there are two other stages before this, the first of which is represented by Abraham and the second by Isaac. It should be noted that the two syllables Ra and Is reappear in these names, the former indicative, as we have seen, of the masculine element of spirit, and the latter of the feminine, while Jacob, or simple unity, is indicative of the neuter. If we look through the history of Abraham, we find the masculine element especially predominant in it. He is the father of the nations that are to spring from him. He receives the covenant of circumcision. He is a warrior, and goes forth to victorious battle. And the change of his name from Abram to Abraham is the substitution of a masculine for a neuter element. In Isaac's history, the feminine element is equally predominant. His name is connected with the laughter of his mother, Genesis 18, and his marriage with Rebekah is the pivot round which all the events of his life center. And again, his acquiescence in his own sacrifice marks the predominance of the passive element in his character. To him there comes no change of name. He is neither leader, warrior, nor spiritual wrestler, but the calm, contemplative man who went out to meditate in the field at eventide. He is typical of the purely receptive attitude of mind, and therefore the syllable is as indicative of his nature as the masculine syllable ra is of his father's, or the neutral and purely mathematical conception indicated by the syllable yak is of his son's. This affords a good instance of the way in which the deepest truths are often concealed in Bible names, and it should lead us to see that the value of the record does not turn on its literal accuracy at every point, but on its correct representation of the great principles to the knowledge of which it seeks to lead us. It is of little moment to us at the present date how much of the book of Genesis is legendary and how much historical, and we can afford to view calmly such little inaccuracies on the face of the document, as when we are told, in Exodus 6:3, that God was not known to Abraham by the name Jehovah, and in Genesis 22:14, that Abraham called the place where he was delivered from sacrificing Isaac Jehovah-Jireh. There are two typical schools of biblical interpretation, one of which is historically represented by Saint Brandon Augustine and the other by Saint Jerome. Augustine, who was not an Orientalist and had not studied the original Hebrew, took his stand upon the textual accuracy of the Bible, and urged that if once any inaccuracy were admitted to exist in it, we could never be certain of anything in the whole book. Jerome, who had made an accurate study of the original Hebrew, admitted the existence of inaccuracies in the text from the operation of the same natural causes which affect other ancient literature, such as errors of copyists, variations of oral tradition, and even possible adaptation to the requirements of something which the transcriber believed to be an essential doctrine. These two representative men were not separated by an interval of centuries, but were contemporaries, and actually in communication with each other, and we may therefore see from how early a date Christendom has been divided into blind reverence for the letter and intelligent inquiry into the history of its documents. St. Jerome was the father of the higher criticism, and with such a respectable authority to back us, we need not be afraid to attribute any such casual errors as the one now in question to those natural causes which render all ancient documents liable to variation. And the point to which I would draw attention is that merely superficial contradictions, which can be reasonably accounted for on purely natural grounds, in no way affect the general inspiration of the Bible. And by inspiration, I mean an inner illumination on the part of the writers, leading them to the immediate perception of truth, which illumination is itself a fact in the regular order of nature, the reason of which I hope to make clear in a subsequent volume. The books of the Pentateuch, as we possess them, were written by Ezra and his scribes after the return from the Babylonian captivity. Those writers, whom the Jews call the men of the great synagogue, and whose writings were separated from the time of Moses by exactly the same interval that separates Tennyson's Idylls of the king from the date of the actual King Arthur. This alone leaves a sufficiently wide margin for errors to creep into such earlier documents as these writers may have availed themselves of, and we must next reflect that another interval of several centuries separated them from the copies conveyed to Egypt in the 2nd century before Christ, for Ptolemy Soter's Greek translation, commonly known as the Septuagint. The Temple Standard Pentateuch, preserved at Jerusalem at the time of Jesus, can hardly have been the original document written by Ezra. But even supposing it to have been so, what became of it at the destruction of Jerusalem. Tradition says it was sent by Josephus to the Emperor of Rome, and written, as it is said to have been, on bulls' hides. We may well imagine that it perished by damp or other agencies, neglected as a barbarous relic in a city whose energies were concentrated on maintaining its position as arbitress of the world by conquest and diplomacy. At any rate, the document was never heard of again, and the oldest Jewish versions of the Pentateuch now extant are not older than the 10th century. Under these circumstances, we need not be surprised if variations have found their way into the text, nor need we trouble ourselves much about them if we reflect that the real place where truth exists is in nature, and not in books, and that the book is merely a record of what others have learnt without book. And, moreover, owing to the deep reverence with which both Jewish and Christian scriptures have been preserved, we may say that any errors or contradictions discovered in the text no more affect the body of the truth contained in the Bible as a whole than the dust on the outside of an orange affects the value of the fruit. It is this inner truth that we are seeking, and if we at all realize the Master's statement that the kingdom is within, superficial discrepancies will not present any difficulties to us. We see then, in the typical history of the three patriarchs, the announcement of the three great principles into which all forms of manifestation may be analyzed: the masculine, positive, or generating principle; the feminine, receptive, or formative principle; and the neuter, or mathematical principle, which, by determining the proportional relations between the other two, gives rise to the principle of variety and multiplicity. Their successive statement in the symbolical history indicates the need for the preparatory study of each in detail if we would arrive at the true light. And it is precisely the discovery that this separate study is by itself insufficient that brings us to the point where we have to wrestle in the darkness with the divine angel until the day dawns. We must unite the three principles into a single unity, and thus learn to form the name Israel. And in so doing, we discover that it has now become our own name, for we find that the kingdom of heaven, the realm of eternal principles, is within us, and that, therefore, whatever we discover there is, that which we ourselves are. Our wrestling ceases. The divine wrestler has put his name upon us, and the day is beginning to dawn. But as yet, it is only the earliest hour of daybreak. It is the true sunlight, but it is still low on the horizon, and we must not make the mistake of supposing that this early morning hour is the same as the midday glory. In other words, we must not suppose that because we have once and forever finished wrestling with an unknown antagonist in darkness, therefore we have nothing more to do. Life is a perpetual doing, though, thank God, not a perpetual wrestling. Our doing is the measure of our living, although the plane on which our doing is carried on may not be immediately patent to all observers, and it is exactly in proportion as we expand our doing that we expand our livingness. No one can grow for us, and it all depends upon ourselves, how rapidly and how strongly we shall grow. Summary. Israel represents the soul's journey toward unity with God. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, are symbolic of spiritual principles that culminate in Israel, meaning one who has prevailed with God. Israel is not merely a nation, but the archetype of the soul learning obedience, sincerity, and one-pointedness. The trials of Israel mirror our inner wrestling with spirit. The soul becomes Israel when it recognizes its wholeness in body, soul, and spirit. This is the beginning of conscious divine sonship. Key takeaways. Israel symbolizes spiritual identity, not nationality. The soul must wrestle with spirit until clarity dawns. Wholeness of being, body, soul, spirit, is the true inheritance. Action. Items. Embrace struggles as opportunities for inner clarity. Commit to sincerity. Living without guile or divided purpose. Reflect daily on the unity of your body, soul, and spirit. Chapter 4. The mission of Moses. Having now gathered up in the briefest possible fashion the general gist of the history of the patriarchs, we must pass on to the mission of Moses. And here let me again impress upon the reader that the Bible repeats its few grand principles over and over again, only with greater detail as it proceeds, so that we shall find precisely the same principles involved in the history of the march of Israel into Canaan as in that of the three patriarchs. It is the same statement as is contained in the story of Eden and in the tradition of the flood, and we shall find it repeated throughout the Bible under other varieties of form which admit of more and more specific application of these principles to individual cases. I mention this to explain why we may sometimes appear to go over old ground. There is only one truth, and more detailed acquaintance with it will not change its fundamentals. We have seen that the Bible teaching regarding man starts with two great facts. First, that he is the image of God reproducing in individuality the same universal mind which is the origin of all things, and thus reproducing also its creative process of thought. And, secondly, that he is ignorant of this truth, and so brings upon himself all sorts of trouble and limitation. And it is the purpose of the Bible to lead us step by step out of this ignorance into this knowledge, step by step, for it is a process of growth, first in the individual, then in the race, and this growth depends on certain clear and ascertainable laws inherent in the constitution of man. Now, the peculiarity of inherent law is that it always acts uniformly, making no exception in favor of anyone, and it does this as well positively as negatively. Our ignorance of any law of nature will never exempt us from its operation, and this is as true of ignorant obedience as of ignorant disobedience. The natural reward of ignorant obedience is no less certain than the natural punishment of ignorant disobedience, and it is on this principle that the great leaders of the race have always worked. They themselves knew the law, but to impart the understanding of the law to people in general was not the work of a day, nor of a generation, nor of many generations. In fact, it is a work which is still only in its infancy, and therefore, if people were to be saved from the consequences of disobedience to the law, it could only be by some method of training, which would lead them into ignorant obedience to it. But this was not to be done by making any false statement of the law, for truth can never come out of falsehood. It must be done by presenting the truth under such figures as would indicate the real relations of things, though not explaining how these relations arise, because to undeveloped minds such an explanation would be worse than useless. Hence came the whole system of the Mosaic Law. On one occasion, when the Master was asked which was the greatest commandment of the law, he replied by quoting the 4th verse of the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," or, as the Revised Version has it, in Mark 12:29, "The Lord is one." This, he says, is the first of all the commandments, and we may therefore expect to find in this statement of the divine unity the foundation on which everything else rests. Nor need we look far to find the reason of it, for we have already seen in the opening words of Genesis that in principio, that is, as the originating principle in all things, there can be nothing else but God or Spirit. That is a conclusion which becomes unavoidable if we simply follow up the chain of cause and effect until we reach a universal first cause. We may call it by what name we choose. That will make no difference so long as we realize what must be its inherent nature and what must be our necessary relation to it. Whatever name we give it, it is always the one, self-existent and self-transforming power of which everything is some mode of manifestation, simply because there is no other source from which anything could come. This ultimate deduction of reason is the recognition of the unity of God, and could not be more clearly stated than in the words which Isaiah puts into the mouth of the divine being, repeating the phrase in 2 consecutive sentences as though to lay additional stress upon it. "There is none beside me." I am God, and there is none else. Isaiah 45, 21, 22. That is to say, God, or, as we have learnt from the instructions to the woman of Samaria, universal spirit, is all that is. This is the great truth on which the mission of Moses was founded, and therefore that mission starts with the announcement of the divine name at the burning bush. Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say unto me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. So the name after which Moses inquired turned out to be no name, but the first person singular of the present tense of the verb to be, in its indicative mood. It is the announcement of being in the absolute, in that first originating plane of pure spirit, where, because the material does not yet exist, there can be no extension in space, and consequently no sequence in time, and where, therefore, the only possible mode of being is the consciousness of self-existence, without limitation either of space or time, the realization of the universal here and the everlasting now, the concentration of the all into the point, and the expansion of the point into the all. But though this may have been a new announcement to the masses of the Hebrew people, it could have been no new announcement to Moses. For we are told in the Acts that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, a circumstance which is fully accounted for by his education at the court of Pharaoh, where he would be as a matter of course initiated into the deepest mysteries of the Egyptian religion. He must therefore have been familiar from boyhood with the words, I am that I am, which, as the inscription Nuk Pu Nuk appeared upon the walls of every temple, and having received the highest instruction in the land, brought up as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he must have been well aware of their significance. But this instruction had hitherto been confined to those who had been initiated into the great mysteries of Osiris. In whatever way we may interpret the story of Moses meeting with the divine being at the burning bush, one thing is evident. It indicates the point in his career when it became plain to him that the only possible way for the liberation of mankind was through the universal recognition of that truth which till now had been the exclusive secret of the sanctuaries. What, then, was the great central truth which was thus announced in this proclamation of the divine name? It has two sides to it. First, that pure spirit is the ultimate essence of all that is, and as a consequence, the all-presence, the all-knowledge, the all-livingness, and the all-lovingness of God. Then, as the corollary of the proposition that spirit is all that is, there must be the converse proposition that all that is spirit. And since man is included in the all, we are again brought back to the original description of him as the image and likeness of God. But in those days people had to be educated up to these two great truths, and they have not advanced very far in this education yet. So from the time when Moses' eyes were opened to see in these truths, not a secret to be guarded for his private benefit, but the power which was to expand to the renovation of the world, he realized that it was his mission to set men free by educating them gradually into the true knowledge of the divine name. Then he conceived a great scheme. Modern research has shown us that the knowledge of this great fundamental truth was not confined to Egypt, but formed the ultimate center of all the religions of antiquity. It was that secret in which the supreme initiation of all the highest mysteries culminated. It could not be otherwise, for it was the only ultimate conclusion to which generations of clear-headed thinkers could come. But these were sages, priests, philosophers, men of education and leisure, and this final deduction was beyond the reach of the toiling multitudes whose whole energies had to be devoted to the earning of their daily bread. Still, it was impossible for these thinkers who had arrived at the great knowledge to pass over the multitudes without allowing them at least a few crumbs from their table. The true recognition of the self must always carry with it the purpose of helping others to acquire it also, But it does not necessarily imply the immediate perception of the best means of doing so, and hence, throughout antiquity, we find an inner religion, the supreme mysteries, for the initiated few, and an outer religion, for the most part idolatrous, for the people. The people were not to be left without any religion, but they were given a religion which was deemed suited to their gross apprehension of things, and in the hands of lower orders of priests, themselves little, if at all, better instructed than the worshippers, these conceptions often became very gross indeed. Nevertheless, in their first intention, the idols were not without meaning. The cultured Greeks laughed at the Egyptian temples as places where, in the midst of a magnificent edifice, when the sacred curtain of the innermost sanctuary was withdrawn, there was revealed an onion or a cat. Yet here was surely enough to prompt an intelligent person to inquiry. Why did the innermost sanctuary contain no Apollo Belvedere or other marvel unique and worthy to be enshrined, but only one of those wretched animals which disturbed the rest of the Greek traveler newly arrived in Egypt by nocturnal caterwaulings, which must have been a marked feature in cities where pussy held undisputed sway? Or why was the odoriferous onion, that lay by tons for sale in the markets here, set up upon a pedestal as an object of reverence? Surely there must be some deep significance in elevating such common objects to the central place of mystery. Yes, because in these commonest of common things there appeared the great central mystery of life, more than in the sculptured marble of Phidias or Praxiteles. Thus, the Egyptian religion signified, to all who had the nous to penetrate it, the all-presence of the eternal living spirit as the one true object of worship, to be found not only in temples, but in streets and fields, in all places alike. It signified this to those who had the intelligence to lift the veil, and this meant, perhaps, 1 in 10,000 of the population. And as soon as he had penetrated the real meaning, his lips were sealed, for he was admitted to the mysteries. For the rest, the priests had such trivial superficial explanations as those which ages later they sought to palm off upon Herodotus. It was no part of their business to lift the veil of Isis. And so, Moses saw the generations toiling on and on in an ignorance which could not but have disastrous consequences sooner or later. Under the paternal rule of a truly illuminated priesthood, such a relation between the inner and the outer religion might be employed to maintain a condition of peaceful well-being for the masses during their intellectual infancy. But he saw that this state of things could not go on indefinitely. With a general advance in intelligence must come a general disposition to question the outward forms of religion, while yet this general advance fell very far short of that fuller development whim, in solitary instances, led the individual to grasp the meaning of the inner truth. Then, when to any nation comes the ridicule of all it has hitherto held sacred, because it has never learnt the eternal truth itself, but has placed its faith in forms and ceremonies and traditions, which, useful in their day and generation, should have been unfolded to meet growing intelligence. When this condition of the national mind supervenes, woe to that nation, for it is left without God and without hope, and by the inevitable law of nature on the plane of mind, it cannot but bring upon itself dire calamity. From the standpoint of the governed, this benign paternal government could not go on forever, and equally so from that of the rulers. What guarantee was there of a perpetual succession of priests illuminated not only in head, but also in heart? Egypt was old when Moses was a youth, and the signs of decadence were not wanting. For the cruel oppression of the Israelites, whom 4 centuries of naturalization should have placed on equality with their fellow subjects, was the very reverse of all that was truest in the inner teaching of the Egyptian temples. It was the index of practical atheism. The science of the temples continued, but it had reached the bifurcation of the way, and it had taken the left-hand path. And if this was the case in Egypt, which led the van of civilization, what was to be expected from the rest of the world? What was the outlook into the future, with an intellectual development expanding only on the material side, without any knowledge of those spiritual truths in which lies the real livingness of life? Surely nothing but the ultimate destruction of mankind and internecine strife, led up to by long ages of that awful spiritual condition in which the outward polish of materialized intellectuality only serves to place additional resources at the disposal of the unmitigated savage within. The system then in vogue had once been a valuable system, perhaps the only one possible, but Egypt was no longer young, and the day of that system had palpably gone by. What was to be done? That great central truth, which the old system had handed down from hoary antiquity, must be made the common appanage of mankind. Nokpu Nok must no longer be the mysterious legend of the temples, but it must become the household word of every family throughout the world. This is the work of generation upon generation, very far from being accomplished yet, and the only way to inaugurate it was by a new departure in which the great announcement that had hitherto been reserved as the last and final teaching must become the first and initial teaching. The supreme secret of the mysteries must be made the starting point of the child's education, and, therefore, the mission to Israel must open with the declaration of the I Am as the all-embracing one. A sentence consists of a subject, copula, and predicate, but in the announcement of the divine name made to Moses, there is no predicate. The reason is that to predicate anything of a subject implies some special aspect of it, and thus by implication limits it, however extensive the predicate may be. And it is impossible to apply this mode of statement to the universal living spirit. There can be nothing outside it. Itself is the substance and the life of all that is or ever can be. That is an ultimate conception from which it is impossible to get away. Therefore, the only predicate corresponding to the universal subject must be the enumeration of the innumerable, the statement of all that is contained in infinite possibility, and, consequently, the place of the predicate must be left apparently unfilled, because it is that fullness which includes all. The only possible statement of the divine is that of present subjective being, the universal I and the ever-present Am. Therefore I Am is the name of God, and the first of all the commandments is the announcement of the divine being as the infinite one. I have discussed the subject of the unity of spirit in my Edinburgh lectures on mental science, but I may repeat here the truth that, mathematically, the infinite must be unity. We cannot think of two infinites, for as soon as duality appears, each member of it is limited by the other, else there would be no duality. Therefore, we cannot multiply the infinite. Similarly, we cannot divide it, for division again implies multiplicity or numbers, and though these may be conceived of as existing relatively to each other within the infinite, the very relation between them establishes limits where one begins and the other ends, and thus we are no longer dealing with the infinite. Of course, all this is self-evident to the mathematician, who at once sees the absurdity of attempting to multiply or divide infinity, but the non-mathematical reader should endeavor to realize the full meaning of the word infinite as that which, being without limits, necessarily occupies all space, and, therefore, includes all that is. The announcement that God is one is, therefore, the mathematical statement of the universal presence of spirit, and the phrase I am is the grammatical statement of the same thing. And because the universal spirit is the universal life itself, over all, through all, and in all, there is yet a third statement of it, which is its living statement, the reproduction of it in the man himself. And these three statements are one, and cannot be separated. Each implies the two others, like the three sides of an equilateral triangle, and therefore the first of all the commandments is that we shall recognize the One. As numerically all other numbers are developed from unity, so all the possibilities of ever-expanding life are developed from the all-including unit of being, and therefore in this commandment we find the root of our future growth to all eternity. This is why both Moses and Jesus assigned to it the supreme place. And here let me point out the intimate relation between the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of Moses. They are the two great figures of the Bible. As the Old Testament centers round the one, so the New Testament centers round the other. Each appeals to the other. Moses says, "Of thy brethren shall the Lord thy God raise up a prophet like unto me." The prophet that was to come should duplicate Moses, and when that prophet came, he said, "If they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead." Each is the complement of the other. We shall never understand Jesus until we understand Moses, and we shall never understand Moses until we understand Jesus. Yet this is not a paradox, for to grasp the meaning of either, we must find the key to their utterances in our own hearts and on our own lips in the words "I am." That is, we must go back to that divine universal law of being which is written within us, and of which both Moses and Jesus were the inspired exponents. The mission of Moses, then, was to build up a nationality which should be independent both of time and country, and which should derive its solidarity from its recognition of the principle of the One. Its national being must be based upon its expanding realization of the great central truth, and to the guarding and developing of that truth this nation must be consecrated. And in the enslaved but not subdued children of the desert, the children of Israel, Moses found ready to hand the material which he needed. For these erewhile wanderers had brought with them a simple monotheistic creed, a belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which, vaguely though it might be, already touched the threshold of the sacred mystery, and 400 years of residence in Egypt had not extinguished, however it may have obscured, the great tradition. Here, then, Moses found the nucleus for the nationality he designed to found, and so he led forth the people in that great symbolic march through the wilderness whose story is told in the Exodus. To the details of that history we may turn more intelligently after we have gained a clearer idea of what the great work really was which Moses inaugurated on the night of the first Passover. Perhaps some of my readers may be surprised to learn that it is still going on, and that they are called upon to take a personal part in continuing the work of Moses, which has now so expanded as to reach themselves. But all this is contained in the commission which Moses first announced to those he was to deliver, and grows naturally out of its unfoldment. The people he was to lead into liberty were the people of God, and since God is the I Am, they were the people of the I Am. This was the true name of this nation, which was to be founded upon an eternal ideal, instead of on the historical conditions of time and the geographical conditions of place. And this essential name of the new nation has been as accurately translated into its equivalent of Israel, as we shall later see that the essential name of God has been translated by the word Jehovah. The people of God, led forth by Moses, were proclaimed by the very terms of his commission to be the people of the I Am. Now, the history of this people is dignified by a succession of prophets such as no other nation lays claim to. Yet the great prophet, who first consolidated their scattered tribes into a compact community, in prophesying of the future of the people he had founded, passes over all these, and, looking down the long centuries, points only to one other prophet, like unto me. We constantly miss those little indications of Scripture, on which the fuller understanding of it so greatly depends. And just as we miss the point when we are told that man is created in the likeness of God, so we miss the point when we are told that this other prophet, Jesus, is a prophet of the same type as Moses. The whole line of intervening prophets were not of that type. They had their own special work, but it was not a work like that of Moses. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the rest sink out of sight, and the only prophet whom Moses sees in the future is brought into his field of vision by his likeness to himself. Any child in a Sunday school, if asked what it knew about Moses, would answer that he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. No one would question that this was the distinctive fact regarding him, and therefore, if we are to find a prophet of the same type as Moses, we should expect to find in him the founder of a new nationality of the same order as that founded by Moses. That is to say, a nationality subsisting independently of time and place, and cohering by reason of its recognition of an eternal ideal. To make Jesus a prophet like unto Moses, he must in some way repeat the Exodus and re-establish the people of the I Am. Now, turning to the teaching of Jesus, we find that this is exactly what he did. There was nothing on which he laid greater stress than the I Am. "Except ye believe that I am, ye shall perish in your sins," was the emphatic summary of his whole teaching. And here, read carefully. Distinguish between what Jesus said and what the translators of our English Bible say that he said, for it makes all the difference. Our English version runs, "If ye believe not that I am he, ye shall die in your sins." John 8:24. Thus, by the introduction of a single word, assuming all sorts of theological doctrines having their origin in Persian and Neoplatonic speculations, the discussion of which would require a volume to itself. Not false doctrines, but great truths are presented in such infantine notions as to convey the most limiting conception of ideals whose vitality consists in their transcending all limitations. Thus, both as theologians and grammarians, the translators of the authorized version felt the want of a predicate to complete the words I am, and so they added the words he. But faithful according to their light, they were careful to draw attention to the fact that there was no he in the original, and therefore that word is printed in italics to show that it was supplied by the translators. And the Revised Version carefully notes this fact in the margin. In the parallel case of the announcement to Moses at the burning bush, the translators did not attempt to introduce any predicate. They felt what I have pointed out, that no predicate could be sufficiently extensive to define infinite being, but here, supposing that Jesus was speaking of himself personally, they thought it necessary to introduce a word which should limit his statement accordingly. Now, the only comment to be made on this passage of the English Bible is to note carefully that it is exactly what Jesus never said. In this connection, he made no personal application of the verb to be what he said was, "Except ye believe that I am, ye shall die in your sins." ARV. Now, if the criterion by which we are to recognize him as the prophet predicted by Moses is his reproduction of the doings of Moses, then we cannot be wrong in supposing that his use of the I am was as complete a generalization as was employed by Moses. On the same principle on which theologians or grammarians would particularize the words to the individuality of Jesus, they might particularize them to Moses also. But going back to that generalized statement of man, which is the very first intimation the Bible gives of him, we find that if I am is the generalized statement of God, it must also be the generalized statement of man, for man is the image and likeness of God. Whatever is true of one is true of the other, only conversely, and, as it were, by reflection, so that whatever is universal in God becomes individual in man. If, then, Jesus was to duplicate the work of Moses, it could only be by taking as the foundation of his teaching the same statement of essential being that Moses took as the foundation of his, and therefore we must look for a generic, and not for specific, application of the I am in his teaching also. And as soon as we do this, the veil is lifted, and a power streams forth from all his instructions, which shows us that it was no mere figure of speech, when he said that the water which he should give would become in each one who drank of it a well of water springing up into everlasting life. He came not to proclaim himself, but man, not to tell us of his own divinity separating him from the race and making him the great exception, but to tell us of our divinity and to show in himself the great example of the I am reaching its full personal expression in man. This prophet is raised up of our brethren. He is one of ourselves, and therefore he said, "The disciple, when he is perfected, shall be as his master." It is the universal I Am reproducing itself in the individuality of man that Jesus would have us believe in. He is preaching nothing but the same old truth with which the Bible begins, that man is the image and likeness of God. He says, in effect, make this recognition the center of your life, and you have tapped the source of everlasting life. But refuse to believe it, and you will die in your sins. Why? As a divine vengeance upon you for daring to question a theological formulary to which some narrow-minded ecclesiastic applies the words of the Vincentian canon, quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus, when his formulary has never even been heard of outside such limits as both historically and geographically give the lie direct to his assertion of always, everywhere, and by all men? Certainly not. Truth has a surer foundation than forms of words. It is deep down in the foundations of being, and it is the failure to realize this truth of being in ourselves that is the refusal to believe in the I Am, which must necessarily cause us to perish in our sins. It is not a theological vengeance, but the law of nature. Let us inquire, then, what this law is. It is the great law that, to live at all, we must primarily live in ourselves. No one can live for us. We can never get away from being the center of our own world. Or, in scientific language, our life is essentially subjective. There could be no objective life without a subjective entity to receive the perceptions which the objective faculties convey to it. And since the receiving entity is ourself, the only life possible to us is that of living in our own perceptions. Whatever we believe does, for us, in very fact, exist. Our beliefs may be erroneous from the standpoint of a happier belief, but this does not alter the fact that for ourselves, our beliefs are our realities, and these realities must continue until some ground is found for a change of belief. And in turn, the subjective entity reacts upon the objective life. For if there is one fact which the advance of modern psychological science is making more clear than another, it is that the subjective entity is the builder of the body. And this is precisely what, on the information we have already gleaned from the Bible, it ought to be. For we have seen that the statement that man is the image of God can only be interpreted as a statement of his having in himself the same creative process of thought to which alone it is possible to attribute the origin of anything. He is the image of God, because he is the individualization of the universal mind at that stage of self-evolution in which the individual attains the capacity for reasoning from the seen to the unseen, and thus penetrating behind the veil of outward appearances, so that, because of the reproduction of the divine creative faculty in himself, the man's mental states or modes of thought are bound to externalize themselves in his body and his circumstances. This, then, is the law of man's being. I do not stop to discuss it in detail, as, writing for New Thought readers, I assume at least an elementary knowledge of these things on their part, and accordingly, this being the law, we see that the more closely our conception of ourselves approximates to a broad generalization of the factors which go to make human personality, rather than that narrow conception which limits our notion of ourselves to certain particular relations that have gathered around us, the more fully we shall externalize this idea of ourselves. And because this idea is a generalization independent of any particular circumstance, it must necessarily externalize as a corresponding independence of circumstances. In other words, it must result in a control over conditions, whether of body or environment, proportioned to the completeness of our generalization. The more perfect the generalization, the more perfect the corresponding control over conditions, and therefore to attain the most complete control, which means the most perfect liberty, we need to conceive of ourselves as embodying the idea of the most perfect generalization. But complete generalization is only another expression for infinitude, and therefore we have again reached the point where it becomes impossible to attach any predicate to the verb to be. And so the only statement which contains the whole law of man's being is identical with the only statement which contains the whole law of God's being, and consequently I am is as much the correct formula for man as for God. But if we do not believe this and make it the center of our life, we must perish in our sins. The Bible defines sin as the transgression of the law, and Jesus' warning is that by transgressing the law of our own being, we shall die. It would carry me beyond the general lines of this book to discuss the question of what is here meant by death, but that it is not the everlasting damnation of the Western creeds is obvious from the single statement of the Bible, that the Master employed the interval between his death and resurrection in teaching those souls who had passed out of physical life in the catastrophe of the deluge, persons who most assuredly had perished on account of their transgression of the law. For further study of this subject, I would refer the reader to the works of two Orthodox divines, Farrar's Eternal Hope and Plumptree's Spirits in Prison. The transgression of which Jesus speaks is the transgression of the law of the I am in ourselves, the non-recognition of the fact that we are the image and likeness of God. This is the old original sin of Eve. It is the belief in evil as a substantive self-originating power. We believe ourselves under the control of all sorts of evils having their climax in death. But whence does the evil get its power? Not from God, for no diminution of life can come from the fountain of life. And if not from God, then from where else? God is the only being. That is the teaching of the first commandment, and therefore whatever is some mode of God. And if this be so, then however evil may have relative existence, it can have no substantive existence of its own. It is not a living originating power. God, the good, alone is that, and it is for this reason that in the doctrine of the One and in the statement of the I Am is the foundation of eternal individual life and liberty. So then the transgression is in supposing that there is, or can be, any living originating power outside the I Am. Let us once see that this is impossible, and it follows that evil has no more dominion over us, and we are free. But so long as we limit the I Am in ourselves to the narrow boundaries of the relative and conditioned, and do not realize that personified in ourselves, it must by its very nature still be as unfettered as when acting in the first creation of the universe, we shall never pass beyond the law of death which we thus impose upon ourselves. In this way, then, Jesus proved himself to be the prophet of whom Moses had spoken. He made the recognition of the I Am the sole foundation of his work. In other words, he placed before men the same radical and ultimate conception of being that Moses had done. But with a difference. Moses elaborated this conception from the standpoint of the universal. Jesus elaborated it from that of the individual. The work of Moses must necessarily precede that of Jesus, for if the universal mind is not in some measure apprehended first, the individual mind cannot be apprehended as its image and reflection. But it takes the teaching both of Moses and Jesus to make the complete teaching, for each is the complement to the other. And it is for this reason that Jesus said, "He came not to destroy the law, but to fulfill." Jesus took up the work where Moses left it off, and expanded Moses' initial conception of a people founded on the recognition of the unity of God into its proper outcome of the conception of a people founded on the recognition of the unity of man as the expression of the unity of God. How can we doubt that this latter conception also was in the mind of Moses? Had it not been, he would not have spoken of the prophet like unto himself that should come hereafter. But he saw the ages during which his great idea must germinate within the limits of a single nationality before it could expand to humanity at large. And therefore, before Jesus could gather into one the people of the I Am from every nation under heaven, it was necessary that one exclusive nation should be the official custodians of the great secret, and mature it till the time was ripe for the formation of that great international nationality which is only now beginning to show forth its earliest blossoms. Summary: Moses' mission was to reveal God's name and lead humanity out of bondage to ignorance. At the burning bush, God declares himself as I Am, the pure being. The Exodus is both historical symbol and spiritual allegory. The soul leaves Egypt, bondage to fear and matter, to enter freedom. The law of Moses trains people into obedience until they can consciously realize truth. Moses is the prophet of universality, proclaiming God as one. His mission laid the foundation for all further revelation. Key takeaways. I Am is the eternal name of God and man. The Exodus represents liberation from ignorance. The law guides until spirit is consciously known. Action items. Meditate daily on the words I am as pure being. Notice where you are still enslaved by fear or limitation. Take practical steps toward freedom in thought and life.
To continue listening, step deeper into the wisdom at Next Level Soul TV, where sacred teachings, spiritual cinema, transformative courses, and divine stories await your soul's unfolding. Enter the portal at www.nextlevelsoul.tv and let your spirit remember what it already knows. Awaken, expand, and evolve.